When my brother tied the knot, everyone received an invitation except me. My father explained that they thought I wouldn't blend well with his new in-laws. So, I silently stopped the $18,000 I'd been sending annually to help with their mortgage. This morning, my brother called in a frenzy, saying Dad was driving around searching for me, and Mom was sobbing in the living room. I'm 32, male, and I learned about my brother's wedding the way you hear about a distant friend's nuptials, through a social media post. A flawless image of him in a tuxedo, grinning beside his bride, with a caption thanking everyone who made their day unforgettable. The comments were flooded with well wishes from familiar faces, cousins I grew up with, even old neighbors from our childhood street. People who were clearly there, celebrating, while I was in my apartment, 3 states away, completely unaware. The knot in my stomach wasn't just about missing the event, it was about what that absence signified. I scrolled through more photos, spotting relatives and acquaintances who'd been invited while I, apparently, wasn't worth a call. That evening, I dialed my parents' house. Mom picked up, her voice heavy with dread when she realized it was me. She clearly wasn't ready for this talk. When I asked why I'd been left out, she passed the phone to Dad without a word. His explanation came with the cold detachment of someone discussing a minor inconvenience. He said they figured I wouldn't mesh with my brother's new family. The bride's family was wealthy, he said, old money with high standards. My brother wanted to impress his in-laws, and my presence might have made things awkward. I pushed for clarity on what that meant. His response was a subtle jab wrapped in practical concern. He pointed out that I never went to college, that my construction job wasn't exactly high status, that I was more at ease in work boots than polished shoes. The bride's family was refined, educated, the kind who vacationed in elite coastal towns and debated fine wines. I wouldn't get their world, he said. He ended by suggesting I shouldn't take it to heart. It was just a pragmatic choice, he claimed, as if my brother's wedding was a corporate deal instead of a family milestone. I hung up and sat in my kitchen, staring at the pile of bills on my counter. Among them was the receipt for the monthly transfer I sent home. $1,500 that went straight to their mortgage. I'd been sending it for nearly 12 years, ever since I started earning a solid income and heard they were struggling. It had become so routine I barely noticed it. Every month, the same payment, the same brief, thanks, text from Mom. The same unspoken agreement that this was just what families do. $18,000 a year, no strings attached, no expectation of praise, just quiet support from the son who apparently didn't belong. But that night, as I ran the numbers in my head, a bitter realization hit me. That money, my money, had likely helped fund the wedding I wasn't invited to. My contributions had eased their financial burden, freeing up funds for things like floral arrangements, catering, and venue costs for an event where I was deemed too out of place to attend. The next morning, I called my bank and canceled the automatic payment. The representative asked if I wanted to adjust the amount or reschedule it. I told her no, just end it entirely. She processed it quickly, and that was that. 12 years of financial support stopped with a brief phone call. I didn't make a scene or send heated messages. I simply withdrew from their financial equation, just as they'd excluded me from their family celebration. If I wasn't good enough to stand by my brother on his big day, my money wasn't good enough to keep their home payments afloat either. The first month passed without a word from them. I wondered if they'd even noticed the missing funds or just assumed it was a bank error they'd sort out later. My life went on as usual, work, weekends. The quiet thrill of seeing my bank account grow for the first time in years. It was surprising how easily I adapted to keeping that money. I bought new work tools, upgraded my truck, and boosted my retirement savings. Things I delayed for over a decade suddenly felt within reach. I realized I'd been living like someone earning far less than I did, funneling my income into my parents' lifestyle while keeping my own modest. By the second month, Mom texted, asking if there was an issue with my bank. She noted the missing transfer and wondered if it was a glitch. I replied that everything was fine on my end, which was true. She didn't follow up, and I didn't offer more details. By the third month, the situation seemed to dawn on them. Dad called one evening, his tone of forced calm that barely hid his worry. He mentioned the missed payments like they were a minor oversight, suggesting I check with my bank about the supposed error. I told him there was no error. I'd stopped the transfers deliberately. The silence that followed was so long I thought the call had dropped. When he spoke again, his voice was sharper, more insistent. He demanded to know what I was trying to pull. I explained I wasn't pulling anything. I'd simply shifted my financial focus to things that valued my presence. He tried to argue, but I cut him off. I reminded him they'd decided I didn't fit their family's new image, so I'd adjusted my budget to match. The call turned heated fast. Dad called me spiteful, accusing me of punishing them for my brother's choice. I pointed out the wedding guest list wasn't just my brother's decision. It was a family call that labeled me unfit for public view. If they felt that way about me, my money probably wasn't welcome either. Dad's voice grew louder as he explained how much they relied on my help, how their budget depended on it, how they'd used it to secure their mortgage. The irony wasn't lost on me. My blue-collar income was polished enough for bank approvals but not for wedding guests. I let him vent until he ran out of steam, then calmly said their dependency went both ways. They leaned on my money while insisting I wasn't good enough for their events. That arrangement no longer worked for me. The months that followed brought a range of attempts to reach me, each with a different tactic. Mom tried guilt, sending pictures of overdue bills and reminding me of their sacrifices when I was young. My brother called once, acting like a neutral third party while hinting I was overreacting to a simple oversight. But none of them addressed the real issue. None acknowledged that excluding me was hurtful or that treating me like a cash machine while sidelining me from family moments was wrong. They wanted the money to flow again without admitting why it had stopped. I kept working, saving, and building the life I should have been living instead of propping up theirs. The extra $18,000 a year was transforming my finances. I was on track to pay off my truck early, doubled my retirement contributions, and started looking into buying a home instead of renting. 6 months after the wedding, my phone rang at dawn on a Tuesday. It was my brother's number, but his voice was frantic, almost unrecognizable. He said Dad had been driving around all night looking for me, and Mom had been crying since the evening before. They'd received a foreclosure notice. The mortgage payments they'd managed without my help had worked for a bit, but they'd been using credit to bridge the gap, and it had caught up with them. They were behind on payments, penalties were piling up, and the bank was starting the process to reclaim the house. My brother's call was a mix of panic and disbelief. He couldn't grasp how things had spiraled so fast, and he seemed stunned I hadn't resumed sending money months ago. He spoke about the house like it was a sacred relic, not a financial obligation they'd taken on assuming my income was guaranteed. I listened with an odd sense of distance. Their crisis was entirely predictable. It was the result of spending beyond their means while relying on money they didn't earn. They'd built their financial life around my contributions without recognizing those contributions were a choice, not a duty. When he finished, he asked what I was going to do. The question felt backwards. This wasn't my problem to fix. It was the consequence of their choices about spending and family priorities. I told him I wasn't doing anything. This was their house, their mortgage, their financial mess. I'd been quietly funding their lifestyle for over a decade, and they'd made it clear my role was purely monetary. Now that I'd stepped back, they were seeing what their finances looked like without my support. My brother's response was a mix of anger and desperation. He said family helps family, that I was being selfish and cruel. I reminded him that family also includes family, but that didn't apply when they planned his wedding. The call ended with him hanging up, frustrated, but the outreach didn't stop. Over the next few days, relatives I hadn't spoken to in ages called, clearly recruited to sway me. Cousins who'd attended the wedding said I was taking it too personally. Aunts and uncles suggested I was punishing the wrong people for my hurt. Each call showed how little they understood. They saw it as simple. Family needs money. Family member has money, so the money should flow. My exclusion from the wedding was treated as a separate issue. But for me, they were linked. The wedding wasn't just a party I missed. It was a clear message about my place in their lives. I was fine as a financial provider, but not as a guest. Good enough to fund their lifestyle, not good enough to share their milestones. The foreclosure process moved forward with cold efficiency. Notices were sent, deadlines loomed, and my parents' financial situation grew dire. Dad called several times, each call more desperate, but none included an apology or recognition of why I'd stopped the payments. Instead, he leaned on arguments about family duty and financial responsibility. He listed everything they'd done for me growing up, every sacrifice, every way they'd supported me. But he never mentioned including me in family events, treating me like a son instead of a donor, or considering my feelings when deciding who belonged at major moments. The irony was that I would have resumed the payments instantly if they'd just owned their mistake. A sincere apology, an admission that excluding me was wrong, an invitation to be part of future family moments as more than a wallet. Any of these would have changed everything. But that never came. Instead, they doubled down on treating the money as something I owed them, not a gift I'd chosen to give. Their approach only confirmed what I'd realized after the wedding. They saw me as a resource, not a family member. Update 1 3 weeks after my brother's frantic call, I was at a job site when I noticed Dad's truck parked nearby. He was behind the wheel, looking like he'd been there for hours. During my lunch break, I walked over. His eyes were red, and when he rolled down the window, his words caught me off guard. No demands, no guilt, no negotiations. Just a broken man admitting he'd ruined everything and didn't know how to make it right. He said the foreclosure was moving forward, and they had less than a month before they'd lose the house. But more than that, he admitted he'd been driving around for days, grappling with the shame of excluding one son from another's wedding because he was embarrassed by his job. His voice cracked as he said he was proud of my career, of how I'd built a life with my hands and supported them for years without asking for anything. He said he'd let his fears about status and wealth cloud his love for his son, and he didn't know how to live with that. Standing there, listening to the man who raised me break down, something shifted inside me. Not forgiveness, but maybe a step toward understanding. Excluding me was wrong, deeply wrong, but it wasn't malicious. It came from insecurity, social pressure, and a misguided effort to help my brother navigate a tricky social dynamic. That didn't excuse it, but it made it human. He asked if there was any way to repair things, any path that didn't end with them losing their home. I said I'd think about it, which was more than I'd been willing to say in months. Update 2 that weekend, I reflected on everything. The pain of being left out, the empowerment of reclaiming my finances, the complex emotions of watching my family unravel. Nothing felt as clear as it had 6 months earlier. On Monday, I called Dad and asked to meet for coffee. He showed up looking exhausted, like he hadn't slept in weeks. I said I wasn't ready to just start sending money again and act like nothing happened, but I also didn't want to watch them lose their home over a hurtful mistake. I laid out my conditions. First, a real apology from everyone involved, not just regret over the financial fallout, but acknowledgement that excluding me was wrong. Second, inclusion in future family events, not as an afterthought, but as a valued member. Third, full transparency about their finances to prevent this kind of dependency again. Dad agreed instantly, almost desperately. He called Mom and my brother from the coffee shop, putting them on speaker so I could hear. Their apologies were raw and sincere, admitting how badly they'd mishandled everything. My brother, especially, broke down, saying he'd been so caught up in impressing his in-laws that he'd lost sight of what mattered. But I also made it clear the financial setup would change. Instead of endless monthly payments, I wanted to help them build a budget they could sustain without my help. The goal was independence, not reliance. I agreed to cover the overdue mortgage payments to halt the foreclosure, but only as part of a plan to make them financially self-sufficient. We'd either refinance to a payment they could afford or sell the house and move somewhere that fit their actual income. Update 3-4 months after that coffee shop meeting, things are slowly improving. The foreclosure was stopped, and we've been working with a financial advisor to overhaul their budget. It turns out they'd been overspending in several areas, using my payments as a crutch to avoid tough choices about their lifestyle. The house is now listed for sale. It was a difficult discussion, but they admitted they'd bought a home they couldn't afford, even with my help. They're now looking at smaller places that align with Dad's pension and Mom's part-time income. My brother and his wife had me over for dinner last month, a small but meaningful gesture. His in-laws were there, and they were friendly, genuinely curious about my work. I suspect the sophistication gap Dad worried about was more his fear than reality. My financial help now is temporary and focused on a clear goal. Instead of open-ended payments, I'm helping them transition to a sustainable setup. It feels different knowing there's an endpoint, that this is about building their independence, not enabling reliance. Our relationship isn't fully healed. Trust takes time. But we're talking regularly, and they're treating me like family, not just a funding source. I'm included in planning, asked for input beyond money, invited to share in family decisions. I've also learned something about myself through this. For years, I sent that money partly out of love, but also because it made me feel needed. Their reliance gave me a secure role in the family, even if it wasn't healthy. Stepping away was hard, but it forced us to redefine our relationships without money as the glue. The wedding exclusion still hurts when I think about it, and it probably always will. But it taught me that real family bonds aren't built on financial transactions or social appearances. They require respect, inclusion, and valuing each person beyond what they provide materially. I'm still saving more for retirement, enjoying the freedom of keeping my income. But I'm also learning that family, like finances, works best when everyone agrees on clear, fair terms. Sometimes, the kindest thing you can do is stop enabling bad choices, even when it's family. Especially when it's family